There's one country in this countdown that changes the meaning of all the others. It is not Bangladesh, it is not Egypt, it is not Pakistan. Those countries matter because real people live inside those systems, and real people pay when reserves disappear, food prices rise, and currencies lose value, but they do not define the world financial system. The country that changes the meaning of the countdown is the one whose currency most people still treat as the safest place on earth. That is the uncomfortable part. When people hear that 7 countries are showing warning signs of sovereign stress, they instinctively place the danger somewhere else. They imagine weak institutions, distant capitals, emerging markets, governments that borrowed too much because they did not know better. That is a comforting thought. It is also a mistake. Sovereign collapses do not all look the same, but they usually rhyme. They begin with debt rising faster than productive capacity. They continue with politicians refusing to tell voters the truth. They move into currency pressure, reserve depletion, and interest costs that grow faster than the economy. Then, at the worst possible moment, leaders reach for the printing press or pressure the central bank to make the problem look smaller than it is. That is the old pattern. Ray Dalio calls it part of the long-term debt cycle. You can use another name if you like. I simply call it what happens when promises outrun income. There are 3 signs I watch. The first is when debt climbs past the point where growth can easily carry it. Around 90% of GDP sovereign debt becomes more than a number on a page. It begins to change behavior. It changes budgets. It changes investor confidence. It changes what a government can do after the next shock. The second is when reserves fall below the level needed to pay for imports and defend the currency. In rich countries, people forget this problem exists because they are used to their money being accepted everywhere. In poorer countries, foreign exchange reserves are oxygen. When oxygen falls, everything else becomes urgent. The third is when political leadership stops respecting monetary discipline. That is usually the decisive signal. A debt problem can be restructured, spending can be cut, taxes can be raised, growth can help. But when the currency becomes the release valve for political cowardice, the damage reaches every person who saves in that currency. Now run that framework through the 7 countries. Bangladesh begins the story because it shows how quickly a success model can become fragile. For years, it grew on garments, exports, and the promise that low-cost manufacturing would keep moving millions out of poverty. Then exports were hit, energy costs rose, the dollar strengthened, reserves fell sharply. Bangladesh does not yet have the debt profile of a doomed country. That is why it sits lower on the countdown. But reserves falling that fast tell you something important. Debt crises often begin before the debt ratio looks terrifying. They begin when the country has to borrow to defend the model that used to work. That is how a strong story becomes a fragile one. Egypt is different. Egypt is not simply another borrower. Egypt sits across a trade artery. The Suez Canal makes it important to the world, and its wheat imports make it vulnerable to the world. A country that imports most of its food while carrying heavy debt is not just managing a balance sheet. It is managing hunger, politics, and currency confidence at the same time. That is why Egypt is dangerous. Debt above 90% of GDP matters. A weak currency matters. IMF programs matter. But the real pressure is social. When bread becomes expensive in Egypt, the problem does not stay inside spreadsheets. It moves into streets. A government can negotiate with creditors. It cannot negotiate with hunger forever. Pakistan is the next stage of the same disease. What makes Pakistan so instructive is that the rescue pattern itself has become part of the trap. IMF program follows IMF program. Each one prevents immediate collapse. Each one comes with conditions. Each one gives the system just enough time to avoid changing deeply enough. Then the country returns to the same door. At one point, Pakistan had reserves covering only weeks of imports. Interest payments consumed a crushing share of federal revenue. Energy imports drained the entire budget. Subsidies that were meant to protect people became debt. Debt became interest. Interest consumed the money that could have been used to fix the energy system. This is how a nation gets trapped by its own postponements. Every delay feels necessary. Every delay makes the final bill larger. Turkey shows what happens when leaders attack credibility directly. Turkey is not poor in the way many people think of fragile countries. It is industrial, connected, strategically important, and institutionally sophisticated in many respects. That is what makes its experience so useful as a warning. A modern country can still wreck its currency if leadership forces policy to obey politics instead of reality. When inflation rose and rates were cut, the market did not need to debate the theory. It sold the currency. People holding lira savings paid the price, and even after policy turned back toward discipline, trust did not return quickly. That is a lesson every country should study carefully. You can lose credibility in months and spend years trying to buy it back. Argentina is the warning written in the largest letters if Turkey shows the speed of credibility loss. Argentina shows the human mechanics of collapse, accounts frozen, savings converted. Dollar promises turned into peso reality official rates that meant one thing on paper and another thing in the street. This is why I never treat sovereign crisis as academic. A default is not just a statement between a government and bondholders. It is a redistribution of pain. It decides who keeps purchasing power and who loses it. It decides whether a retired person can buy medicine. It decides whether a business can import parts. It decides whether years of careful saving still mean what the saver thought they meant. Argentina has survived, and that matters. Some countries develop a strange resilience after repeated crises, but surviving is not the same as thriving. An adaptation to dysfunction is not a financial strategy. Other nations should copy. Then comes Japan. Japan is the quiet giant in this story for decades. People pointed at Japan's debt ratio and said it proved debt did not matter. I would say it proved something more specific. Debt can matter later than people expect when a country borrows from itself, saves heavily, holds social cohesion, and maintains domestic demand for its own bonds. That is not the same as saying debt does not matter. Japan's debt is enormous. The reason the system held is that the creditors were mostly domestic and the rates were extremely low. But once inflation appears and rates begin to move, the old bargain becomes harder to maintain, raise rates too much, and debt service becomes impossible. Keep rates too low, and the currency weakens while savers lose purchasing power. That is not a clean policy choice. That is a trap disguised as stability. Japan may not fall first, it may not fall suddenly, but it shows what the end of postponement can look like in a rich country. Now we arrive at the United States. This is where people become emotional. They do not want America mentioned in a countdown that includes countries already in crisis. They say, America is different. They are right. America is different. It has the reserve currency. It has the world's deepest treasury market. It has extraordinary companies, innovation, military strength, agricultural capacity, energy resources, and financial infrastructure. It can borrow in its own currency. That is a privilege of almost immeasurable value. But the danger is not that America looks like Pakistan tomorrow. The danger is that Americans use the word different to mean immune. No country is immune to arithmetic. The United States now pays more in interest on its national debt than it spends on defense. That is not a small milestone. It means the past has become one of the largest items in the present budget, and interest is a silent claimant. It does not ask voters for permission. It does not build anything. It simply arrives. When interest expense rises, every other national choice becomes harder. Taxes, spending, defense, infrastructure, entitlements, investment. All of it sits under the shadow of promises already made. The dollar makes this process slower. The dollar makes it easier to finance. The dollar attracts buyers because the world still needs dollar assets. But foreign buyers are not charities. They watch real purchasing power. They watch inflation. They watch deficits. They watch whether a country intends to repay honestly or inflate quietly. A reserve currency country usually does not default the way a weak emerging market defaults. It defaults more subtly. It pays back in money worth less. It lets inflation do what politicians cannot say out loud. It preserves the nominal promise while eroding the real value. That is why this countdown is not a prediction that the United States collapses tomorrow. It is a warning that the same cycle can reach the strongest country in a different form. The weak countries face default. The middle countries face recurring currency trauma. The rich countries face erosion, repression, inflation, reduced privilege, and slower declines that are easier to deny. In many ways, slow decline is more dangerous for investors because it does not force an immediate reaction. People adjust to it. They explain it. They call it temporary. They assume the next election, the next central bank meeting, or the next innovation cycle will fix it. Sometimes time helps. Sometimes time just compounds the debt. The reason I care about this pattern is simple. I have spent my life thinking about what survives. A good investor is not the person who can name the exact date of a crisis. That is a fool's game. A good investor is the person who understands fragility before fragility becomes obvious. If a country depends on low rates forever, that is fragile. If a household depends on one currency holding its purchasing power forever, that is fragile. If a government depends on creditors never asking hard questions, that is fragile. If an investor depends on central banks being able to rescue every market at the same time, that is fragile. The countries in this countdown are not identical. Bangladesh has a reserve problem before a debt problem. Egypt has a food and currency problem inside a strategic trade corridor. Pakistan has a recurring rescue problem. Turkey has a credibility problem. Argentina has a history of legal and currency betrayal. Japan has a debt loop problem. The United States has a privilege erosion problem, different surfaces. Same underlying cycle, promises rise, confidence weakens. Currency absorbs pressure. People discover that money is not the same thing as purchasing power. That last distinction matters more than almost anything. If you save the dollars, yen, pesos, livre, pounds, or any other currency, you are not really saving paper. You are saving purchasing power. The question is not whether your account balance remains the same. The question is whether that balance still buys the same amount of food, energy, housing, medical care, labor, and productive assets. In a sovereign crisis, account balances can lie, prices tell the truth. So what should an ordinary investor take away? Not fear. Fear produces bad decisions. Not arrogance either. Arrogance is how people lose money in slow motion. The right response is respect. Respect for debt, respect for currency risk, respect for political incentives, respect for the fact that governments under pressure will often protect the system before they protect the saver. That means owning productive assets. It means not depending entirely on one currency or one government promise. It means keeping leverage low enough that volatility does not force you to sell good assets at bad prices. It means understanding that diversification is not a slogan. It is protection against being completely wrong about which part of the system breaks first. 7 countries are not collapsing in the same way, but all 7 are revealing the same truth. The modern financial world is built on confidence, and confidence is not permanent. It is earned, spent, borrowed against, abused, and eventually tested. When that test comes, the public will ask why nobody warned them. The warning is already here. It is in the debt ratios. It is in the reserves. It is in the currencies. It is in the interest bill. It is in the quiet selling by creditors. It is in the politicians who would rather blame markets than admit promises exceeded income. The country that falls first may be far away. The lesson will not be.